The world fell not with an explosion, but with a signature that was not mine. At the stock exchange, amidst the opening bell, the strobes of cameras, and the smooth hands of investors, my passport, my signature, my company, and a word that cut through the flesh, suddenly appeared on the main screen. False. I stood next to the mayor, gavel in hand, ready to strike the gong, when the phones in the hall simultaneously vibrated like a swarm of metal insects. A second later, my bank sent a message, accounts frozen in accordance with the regulator's decision. The lenses clicked, and I realized that right now they were painting a new face on me. The face of a thief who had deliberately signed papers from which, it seemed to me, I had always kept my distance. I didn't fall, I smiled, colorlessly, almost sinisterly, and asked for the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," technical pause, I said, and I was met with a cold hum of disbelief. In the inner corridor, which always smelled of coffee and metal ventilation, my CFO, a man I trusted as myself, was waiting for me. "Isn't that you?" I asked quietly, almost in a whisper that made the walls tighten. He looked at me longer than friendship would allow, and replied as if reciting a pre-rehearsed prayer. "You signed. You always signed." And then I realized that from now on, every "you" would be directed at me, even if I didn't touch the ink. My mother called not to reassure me, but to breathe my fear with me. "Son, the TV is screaming in your voice, and it's not you," she said, and there was more truth in her words than in all my press releases. I left the building through the service exit, and there, amidst the smoke from the kitchen and the garbage cans, a courier in a cheap jacket with a logo that was sticking out like a bad conscience approached me. "For you. From someone who knows." He handed me an envelope, thin and hard, like a sentence. Inside were copies of contracts with my signature, perfectly reproduced, but with one microscopic wound. In the letter P, the stroke went up, and I always pulled it down. Attached to the papers was a faded childhood photo. Me, my father, and my current CFO, a boy from the side, barely visible. But even then he was looking straight into the lens, as if he could see further than anyone else. On the back, handwritten, in his father's familiar stern handwriting, "If you read, you are already in someone else's game. They don't buy the truth, they give it back." I stood between the noise of the city and the silence of that phrase, and felt myself enveloped not by anger or shame, but by an eerie clarity. What was destroying me was assembled by the hands of those who had known me longer than I had become myself. I tried to resist, but every move I made was evidence against me. The lawyers I paid millions to were silent, claiming no comment. The phone book, once full of allies, now resembled a graveyard, numbers silent, as if they had never existed. I would call old partners, and in return I would hear a dry, "We've already signed a deal with someone else, sorry." The media tore me apart, showing montages of my voice superimposed over fake recordings. For the first time, I saw myself through the eyes of others, as a fraud who had supposedly finally been exposed. Government investigators summoned me for questioning. I sat in a sterile, white-walled room, and in front of me lay documents signed in my handwriting, but with decisions I had never made. I tried to explain that it was a fake, that I had been betrayed by those closest to me, but the investigator only smiled, touching his pen to the sheet of paper, as if enjoying my fall. "You understand," he said, "that from today you are a toxic asset. No one will save someone who has left his mark in the blood of numbers." But the biggest blow came not from the state or from business. It came from home. The brother I had once bailed out of debt gave an interview in which he called me a monster who had spent his life buying love with money. His words were like a knife that went straight into my chest, not my back. He was always greedy. He even turned his family into an investment. It was all over the news, and I could see how people believed him more than any of my explanations. That evening I sat in my penthouse without light because the electricity had been cut off, a supplier's error, even though I knew full well that it was a signal. The city outside the window glowed with a strange life, and I held the photograph from that envelope in my hands. It showed us as children, and I suddenly felt that my entire imperial life was just a thin skin over a wound that had now burst open. I had been betrayed by those who should have been the wall, and in that moment I understood. I had lost more than just money and power. I had lost my name, and when I held the photograph closer to the light of the street lamp, For the first time in many years, I felt real fear. Not for my wealth, not for my status, but for the fact that I was no longer in a world where a name was more valuable than the truth. I didn't know who sent that first envelope, but the next evening another one appeared on my desk. It had been pushed under the door, and inside was just a flash drive and a short note. You look for the enemy outside, but he was always inside you. Open it, and you will see. I trusted nothing and no one, but I pressed the power button on the old laptop I had once kept for archives. The screen came to life, and dozens of videos opened on it. Recordings of internal meetings, copies of correspondence, scanned contracts. And in every frame, next to me was my CFO. He signed, he negotiated, using my name. And when the documents reached the final signature, he slipped an electronic trail created using biometric copies of my handwriting, which I myself had once carelessly left in banks. I sat in the dark, listening to his voice, which sounded like my own, and suddenly I noticed a detail. In several videos, another silhouette appeared in the mirror image of the window. A woman. She stood to the side, silent, but looking straight into the camera, as if specifically for me. I zoomed in on the frame and felt my heart sink. It was my ex, the one who had left me 10 years ago after the scandal with my unfaithful love. I thought her mark had long since been erased, but now she was at the center of the conspiracy again. I didn't have time to think when my phone flashed with a message. You don't understand the main thing. Meet me tomorrow at midnight outside the old factory. Come alone. The number was anonymous, but I knew it was her. The next night, a cold wind drove dust through the empty factory yard. I arrived without security, without witnesses, and she stepped out of the shadows. Older, sterner, but her eyes remained just as sharp. You always thought you were building it yourself, she said. In fact, you've been building a prison for yourself all your life. And he, your loyal friend, has only closed the door. She handed me a folder as thick as a Bible. There's more truth here than you're willing to know. These documents aren't just a conspiracy against you. They're the stories of your father, your partners, even your mother. They were all part of the game long before you decided to call yourself the master of an empire. I opened the first page and saw a familiar handwriting, my father's. They were letters where he described deals he'd made back in the 90s, when I was a kid. Deals with the same people who were trampling on my name today. He knew this day would come, and he left me not an inheritance, but a trap. I closed the folder, looked at it, and asked, "Why are you giving me this?" She smiled, but there was no joy in her smile. Because I'm the only one who still believes you can escape. But to do that, you'll have to destroy more than just him. You'll have to destroy yourself. And then I realized, what I held in my hands was not proof or a sentence. It was forbidden knowledge, the key that would either set me free or erase me from the map of the world forever. I chose a path that smelled of powder and water, and I felt a rhythm in my chest that I had never allowed myself to hear in the noise of success. The rhythm of fear becoming determination. I did not want to rush into blind revenge, but I stood before the mirror and saw a man I had never fully known. Not just a businessman who counted his profits at night, but someone for whom the truth could be a rusty sword or a last line of defense. The woman from the factory was with me, and her presence made the choice more human, because she did not come for fame or seeking a restoration of status. She came to force me to answer the question I had put off all my life. Am I willing to lose my wealth so as not to become what others described me as? We decided to proceed carefully, like surgeons who understand that excessive force kills the patient. I released some of the documents through the independent press, but not the whole truth at once. A gesture designed to diffuse the flames of lies while preserving the tool that would strike at the heart of the conspiracy. My CFO responded with a blow, more fake records, more interviews in which I was portrayed as a predator. I knew that from now on every word I said would be read for hidden meanings, but I spoke openly, acknowledging my mistakes, those small and large compromises that I had once made for the sake of growth, which had become the basis for someone else's meanness. I am not an angel, I said to the cameras, and in that simple phrase was all my guilt and all my hope at the same time. The climax came when I knocked on the door of someone I considered a friend. We sat across from each other in the room where the most important decisions had once been made, and there was no shouting in the conversation, just the slow laying of facts, like cards on a table. He didn't ask for mercy. He just coldly observed that truth was a rare resource and expensive to those who sold it. I felt the resistance melting away in me, and then I decided to take the hardest step of all, to give up part of the empire, to sacrifice the assets he needed most, in order to bring to light the full dossier on everyone involved, even if it meant losing control of what I would call my own for the rest of my life. It was an act that combined anger and humility in me, a desire to restore my name and a willingness to pay with my own power. When the documents went public, the system shook, the boundaries between perpetrator and victim blurred, and in this chaos I felt an unusual freedom, not freedom from the court, but freedom from the need to control everything. In the midst of the struggle, I lost friends and enemies, but I gained something more important, the ability to look at myself without being reflected by others. At the end of that night, when the streets of the city were almost silent, I sat alone in my office and felt that the decision was the right one, not because it restored my status, but because it allowed me to save face in front of myself. I didn't become a hero in the newspapers. I didn't get apologies from those who betrayed me, and I didn't wait for recognition from those who stood by me while it was convenient. My accounts remained half frozen. My buildings and assets were transferred to others. My name in search engines still accompanied the words corruption and fraud. But in the silence, as I turned off the lights in my modest new office, I felt my breathing become easier. Because for the first time in many years, I had stopped playing the role that had been imposed on me, whether by friends or enemies or even family. One evening, I met my brother. He was standing at the entrance to an old coffee shop, not in a designer suit, but in a cheap jacket, and he looked at me as if he wanted to say something but couldn't. I walked over, and there was a silence between us. "Did you really think I was the enemy?" he finally asked. I didn't answer, because the answer was more complicated than a yes or a no. He was part of that conspiracy, perhaps unknowingly, but it was to his advantage to remain silent when my name was being trampled on. We didn't hug, we didn't reconcile, we simply walked past each other, understanding that blood is not always stronger than fear and profit. The woman who brought me the folder disappeared as suddenly as she had appeared. She left only a short message. "Now you know that your wealth has always been only the shadow of old debts." I reread these words several times and felt that I finally understood the main thing. I was never the master of my life. I was only the heir to other people's decisions and other people's sins. Today I sit by the window and look at the city that no longer looks at me. I hear the wind howling in the darkness, and I think, is it possible to remain rich and at the same time honest? Isn't the pursuit of wealth itself a compromise that always leads to lies? And if so, what is worth living for? Success that disappears with a single signature, or truth that doesn't bring money but leaves a person with a face? I don't know the answer. Maybe there isn't one. But when I close my eyes, I don't see myself as a businessman, not as the owner of wealth, and not even as the victim of a conspiracy. I see only a person who has finally learned to ask the right questions. And perhaps this is the greatest wealth that cannot be stolen.